What's up, Internet world? Welcome to the second episode of Knowledge and Resistance. Today's episode, I want to talk to white people specifically about racism. Racism obviously it's a topic that is obviously very controversial, but I think it's one that is also very misunderstood by white people, at least collectively. I think that racism is collectively misunderstood by white people because the way that it's been taught to us has been, at best, irresponsible, at worst, intentionally done to perpetuate racism. As white people, particularly white parents, we have a tendency to allow the school system, the school curriculum, to be the primary teachers of racism to our kids. The reason that this is a problem is because the school curriculum, the way that it looks and the way that it's implemented and the way that it is designed today is the same as it was 100 years ago. This is because the school system was designed, it was created by and for white people. And it was designed and created to make white people look or shed a more favorable light on white people. Even when we're being taught, our egregious history, it's still taught in a way that that makes white people look as though we're heroic. And so obviously this is a problem, and the way that it teaches racism specifically is very one-dimensional. It's very static. And because of this, that is what makes the school system itself a white supremacist institution. And it's also what is the root cause of a school system that churns out generation after generation of white kids who grow into white adults who will do anything to keep from being called racist except not be racist. And that's because the way that we learn about what racism is, we start becoming more concerned with not being thought of as racist than we are with unlearning our own racism, the own racist proclivities that we are inherently indoctrinated, well, not inherently, but our own racist proclivities that we are indoctrinated with. But what we need to understand overall is that these racist indoctrinations, these racist attitudes, these subconscious racist ideas that we are conditioned, that we are socialized to have, they're only expressions of a greater system that is where racism actually comes from. That is the actual bedrock of racism. And that's because our misunderstanding of racism is the fact that we fail to understand that racism requires power. right? Racism is not just an attitude towards, a specific race of people. We have to grasp the concept that racism requires power. We have to grasp the concept that prejudice and discrimination are not the same as racism. That while racism does require prejudice and discrimination, it also requires power. We need to understand that racism is prejudice and discrimination with the power to enforce it, thereby affecting the everyday lives of an entire race of people. Now, because we live in a society that was built on the backs of enslaved people, and because those enslaved people were enslaved on the basis of the color of their skin, those people, or the descendants of those people, lack any sort of power. And they have been barred from gaining any sort of power in this society. In a society built by their ancestors. In a society where their ancestors were forced to labor and toil and sweat and torture day in and day out for 300 years. That society still stands today. And because that society still stands today, their descendants are barred from gaining any sort of power. And because they don't have any sort of power, because it is virtually impossible for them to gain power in a society where in a society that was built by their ancestors who were powerless, they cannot be racist. This is why reverse racism doesn't exist. This is why there's no such thing as reverse racism. Reverse racism is a concept that is not only erroneous but ridiculous, because racism itself requires power. Stokely Carmichael once said, "If a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If a white man has the power to lynch me, that's my problem." And that is a summary analysis of what racism is and how racism has to be played out in order to even exist, in order to even be a threat. So, white people, if a black person calls you a cracker, if a black person discriminates against you because you're white, guess what? That ain't racism. You are not oppressed. We are not oppressed based on the color of our skin. If your feelings get hurt, deal with it. Because I can promise you that your hurt feelings over being discriminated against for the color of your skin isn't even a fraction of what it's like to actually be oppressed based on the color of your skin. Another misunderstanding that we tend to have as white people about racism is what constitutes racism. Like I said, the public school system, or the school system at all, the school curriculum in this country, the way that it teaches racism is very one-dimensional. It teaches us that racism looks like burning crosses and white hoods. That it looks like overt terrorism, bombing churches and lynchings, things like that. And essentially what we get from learning racism in this way is that we start to think that racism, or we start to think that hate is necessary for racism, and it isn't. Hate is not a requirement for racism. Hate is an expression of racism. It's one of many different expressions of racism, but it is not required for racism. Now, even though the dictionary definition of racism itself is problematic, and I'll explain why in a minute, we can go to the dictionary definition and see that racism is based on a inferior superior perception. It's based or it's rooted in the idea of one race being inferior and one race being superior. The love-hate dynamic is not necessary. The hate aspect is not necessary. You can love a dog and still treat it like it's inferior to you. You can love a dog and still have power over the dog and still subjugate the dog to your whim. This is particularly, or specifically, I should say, why you can have a black friend and still be racist. This is specifically why you can have a black partner and still be racist. In fact, this is specifically why you can have black children and still be racist. Because one of the most misunderstood aspects of racism is that it is static and that it is one-dimensional, and that could not be farther from the truth. Racism is not only dynamic, but it's durable. Racism can take many different shapes, it can take many different forms, and it does so in order for it to adjust itself to the times so that it can fit within the framework of modern society. This is how racism has been able to withstand the test of time. This is why we see what happened with Philando Castile and what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. This is why we see these things happening 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years after Jim Crow, after Bobby Hutton, after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, after Rodney King, right? The same things keep happening over and over again. The times are changing, but the racism is still there. Because racism is durable and it's dynamic. And we need to understand that as white people, we are born into a society that is meant to condition us with racist ideas, with racist attitudes, with racist feelings, but that these attitudes and these feelings are only expressions of a system that actually has the power to enforce the racism. These attitudes, these feelings, they're only symptomatic of a system, of a society that is run with a system that is run with the mechanisms that functions in a particular way that benefits us based on the color of our skin and is a detriment to anyone who does not have this skin color. So with all of that being said, there's five things that we as white people need to understand, that we need to come to terms with about racism in order to dismantle racism, in order to eradicate racism. There's five fundamental facts that we need to understand. Fact 1, racism requires power. Racism is prejudice and or discrimination with the power to enforce it. Capitalism is where racism gets its power from. Chattel slavery was the scientific means through which capitalism was achieved. Thus, the slave trade was the capital for capitalism. This means that because black people were the enslaved race, they have been systematically barred from obtaining any power in this society. Fact 2. The aforementioned definition of racism is also why reverse racism cannot exist. Prejudice and discrimination are not the same thing as racism. While black people, or people of color at all, can be prejudiced, while they can discriminate, they cannot be racist. Fact 3, and this is a very important one. Integration did not mean equality. In order for integration to equal equality, the system that black people were integrated into would first have had to have been equal. Black people were integrated into an unequal system and placed at the bottom of it. Fact 4. Racism is durable and it's dynamic and it takes on many different forms and many different shapes. It doesn't only target skin color, it also targets culture. The white savior complex that manifests through things like missionary work, international litigious processes, the nonprofit industry, all of these things can be just as racist, are just as racist as the Ku Klux Klan. They are just as racist as burning crosses. Things like cultural appropriation. This is when, as white people, we start taking on things, aspects of other cultures, primarily the black culture, and we start trying to make them our own. Things like, things like, putting dreadlocks in our hair. Things like, putting cornrows in our hair and calling them box braids. Things like, white people trying to rap and not paying homage and not showing respect and appreciation to the people and to the culture that created rap in the first place. These are all forms of racism, and we need to understand that, particularly like the white savior complex, that black people need white people to help save them, to free them, whether it be here or in Africa or wherever. It's based on the idea that black people lack the sufficient ability to free themselves, right? And that is a perception of inferiority, right? Just as much as saying that hip hop is inherently violent, right? These are all ideas that stem from the perception of skin color and culture being inferior. So we need to understand that racism it's very dynamic, and we need to be vigilant. We need to be on the lookout, not only for expressions and instances and situations of it, in our communities and in our everyday lives, but also in our own thought processes. And fact 5. I said earlier that, or I mentioned something about the dictionary definition of racism being problematic. And here's why. The dictionary definition, no matter what dictionary you look in, the dictionary definition of racism is problematic because dictionaries are written by institutions that are owned, that are operated, that are undertaken with the idea of the current system that we live in as being a relevant, or as being a legitimate system. That is a white supremacist idea. It's what that the system that we live in was designed and created by white people for white people, and maintained by white people. White people benefit from it. If we're operating within it, and we're operating under the assumption, or under the pretense that it's a legitimate system, then anything that is resultant from this assumption is going to inherently be white supremacist. Dictionaries operate under this pretext. Dictionaries operate, or the institutions that create dictionaries, whether it be universities, which is part of the school system, which we already established is white supremacist, or whether it be, an independent institution that hires its own lexicographers. I doubt I said that right, but no matter what, they're going to be white supremacists. They're going to be created by white people. Even if you don't like the term white supremacist, fine, get rid of that. You don't even have to pay attention to that. Just understand that they're designed and created by white people in a society that was designed and created for white people. Which means, because white people created racism, we cannot define racism. And here's why. We created racism. We created chattel slavery. We created slavery based on the idea of skin color making the people that we were enslaving inferior to us. And that's racism. That was the beginning of racism. We invented racism. Because we invented racism, we cannot define racism. Letting white people define racism is like letting a sexual predator define rape. It's that simple. Now, as the Venerable Angela Davis once said, it is not enough to not be racist. In this society, we have to be anti-racist. Which means if we're just walking around not doing anything about racism, if we're not actively attacking racism, then we are complicit in it. These 5 points that I just mentioned, they are not a comprehensive guide. They are not... if we want to see an end to racism, we have to be vigilant, and we have to keep, while we do have to keep these 5 fundamental points in the forefront of our mind, we also have to remember that racism goes way deeper, that racism is far too complex to be summed up in only 5 points. However, these 5 points are a good... understanding these 5 points are a good place to start. And if we start from these 5 points, we can utilize the tools that these 5 points give us to dig deeper into understanding racism. And once we understand racism, we can start to understand how to eliminate racism from our society. So, I hope that I was able to clarify racism a little better for some of the white people who may have kind of an antiquated understanding of what it is. And I hope that we can start to put our egos and our feelings aside when it comes to understanding racism, so that we can actually eliminate it from our society. It is a virulent, destructive force. We created it. As white people, we created racism. We created this virulent, destructive force. And as such, it's our responsibility to eliminate it. So, if you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe to my page. I will be uploading videos bi-weekly, every other week. If you like the content, let me know in the comment section. Make sure you like it, share it, and remember to subscribe. And I will see you on the next episode.